Hey everyone, welcome to yet another video in which I drone endlessly about watches. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the Breitling SuperOcean Heritage, in particular the 46mm chronograph, reference number A13320. However, my comments are going to apply similarly across the range. I'm going to talk about my thoughts about its appearance and its design, and my general comments about the watch. And this watch in particular that I'll be talking about is in fact for sale at the moment, both on my own website, luxuryprofessor.com, but also on Value Your Watch. So if you're interested in the watch, go check it out there. But in any case, let's dig deeper into what's going on with it. So let's start with the basics. The Breitling SuperOcean Heritage Chronograph uses the Breitling B13 movement, which is based on the ETR or Valjoux 7750 movement. This is a relatively standard workhorse movement, which has some useful characteristics. It's got 42 hours of power reserve, 28,800 beats per minute, and also 25 joules. So it's a relatively ordinary workhorse movement that you would expect to see in watches of this nature. Breitling uses this in many of their chronographs. Now if we look at the dial, we can see several sub-dials within it. We've got the ordinary second sub-dial, but also two other chronograph-related sub-dials. We've also got a date window because this, unsurprisingly, has a date complication. Now in order to adjust things, we've got the two push buttons for the chronograph, which function ordinarily like you would expect from a chronograph. The top button starts things moving. If we look at the crown, well, the crown is signed, it has the Breitling B logo on it, but it's also a screw-down crown. So you unwind it, and then when you unwind it, it has hacking. So for example, the second hand is going to stop moving when you fully unwind it, and you can set the hour hand doing so. Furthermore, using the crown, you can also set the date, which again is relatively standard. Now that's in general what the movement is. As I've indicated, it's a relatively robust movement that Breitling's been using for quite some time. If we look at the dial and the bezel and the general front of the watch, we can see that the dial is black, however the dial can come in various other colours. The bezel, again, is in black, however it is unidirectional, which means you can twist it one way, but it locks going the other way. Now one useful way to test whether the watch is reasonably maintained is whether it has very much give on the other direction. That is, whether it's going to wiggle around very much. You want that bezel to not wiggle around. You want it to move to one direction and then really lock in and not be able to move backwards. So in general terms, that's what the front of the watch is. If we switch around to the back of the case, we can see it isn't really that heavily decorated. We've got a Breitling logo, we've got some other text, but it isn't see-through, it's not transparent, there's not really very much else there. It's standard enough, it looks attractive enough, but is not exactly over the top or particularly interesting otherwise. If we look at the strap, well, there are really a couple of options for this. You could either get it in the rubber strap or you could get it in a bracelet. To my mind, the bracelet was a little bit over the top, a little bit shiny. It didn't actually look that good on the watch itself. However, that's of course personal taste. This watch in particular has the rubber strap on it. Now there have been a couple of iterations of the rubber strap, however the one that you'd most commonly see is the one that has some of the circles or the cutouts on the side. It's reasonably comfortable to wear. However, which of these straps, the strap versus the bracelet you prefer, well that's really going to come down to personal preference. I personally prefer the rubber strap, but again, it's up to you. If you go back around to the clasp, well, the clasp has push buttons to open it up. You can adjust it, of course, if you need to resize it. However, obviously, there are some limits to how much you can do this. Now, as I indicated, you push the buttons to open it up. There have been various different iterations of what exactly this clasp looks like. However, it is always going to have that Breitling B logo on it, and that should be in the front of that clasp. It tends to function relatively smoothly. Now, in terms of the operation of the watch and the clasp and all of that, well, again, it is relatively smooth overall. The crown runs relatively smoothly, or at least it should in all of the models you're testing out. If there is much resistance on it, well, you know that it could be a bit of an issue. The clasp on the back of the watch with the strap, well, again, that functions relatively smoothly. If you're facing too much resistance, or if something's caught in it, that's something you'd want to check out. In this case, however, it's going relatively smoothly. In terms of the dimensions of the watch, well, as I indicated, it's 46mm in diameter. The lug width is 24mm. It sounds relatively big, and in fact it's on the larger size, but it isn't in fact that gargantuan when you actually wear it. And if we put it side by side with, say, a 36mm Datejust, it doesn't actually look that much bigger. It's clearly noticeably bigger than the 36mm Datejust, but it isn't so much bigger that it looks giant-sized. And I will personally wear a 36mm Datejust, sometimes bigger than that, but the 36mm works fine on my wrist. And I also personally think the 46mm Breitling SuperOcean Heritage also works fine on my wrist. So I wouldn't have too much problem going up to that size. So again, whether or not you like the size or not, personal preference, but I don't find this to be too oversized. It's not too over large, despite the seemingly large dimensions. If you're used to wearing Panerais, this should be relatively familiar to you. Now, if we look at the hour markers, well, we can see that those are stick markers. There's also lume associated with this. Now, it is a little bit difficult to see in the light. However, when we turn the lights off and sort of look at the lume, we can see it is actually reasonably quite bright. It's quite noticeable, but of course, many people weren't actually using this in a situation where they need lume, but it still is nice to have. Now, interestingly enough, the Breitling SuperOcean Heritage has been made for quite a few years now, and has looked pretty much the same across all of these years, albeit with some subtle differences. So whichever year you get, it isn't going to make that much difference in the grand scheme of things. So those are the basics of the watch. What then do I think about it? Well, all of this is going to be subjective. You'll have your own view about which watches you like and which watches you don't like. I personally like the Breitling SuperOcean Heritage for a few reasons. Firstly, when I've had it, it's filled a gap in my repertoire of watches. It's an informal watch that doesn't really go with suits or in a work context, but it works outside of that. It works in that more informal setting where I need a watch that's kind of sporty in nature, more sporty than something like a Datejust would otherwise be. Furthermore, I found it to be reliable. I've never had any issues with the movement, any issues with it starting going, any issues with the bezel, or any issues with anything else. It's always worked as I would expect it to do so, which is exactly what you would want from a watch that is ultimately going to be a little bit on the pricey side. I find that it tends to work okay in my wrist as well, and I've worn Panerais as well, so I actually quite like the size. I think it works well as a good size, although again, that's subjective. It will depend upon exactly what you are looking for in a watch. Now, in terms of value for money, it is a little bit difficult to beat. It's a reasonably large watch at 46mm, has a chronograph function, and is from a well-known, good quality brand. So it's difficult to do that much better than the Breitling SuperOcean Heritage. Not only that, it doesn't actually depreciate that much because the design remains relatively consistent over the years, and therefore you're not being usurped or replaced by the next model in the next year. Rather, all of these years start to merge together, which is good from a value for money or a value retention basis. I.e., if you buy it and then you need to sell it because you need the money or you just want to move on, it isn't necessarily the worst prospect in the world, and that then also appeals to me. So from a subjective perspective, I actually really quite like the watch because it sort of fits a gap in the wardrobe. I think it's a good size, I think it's a good quality brand, it's robust, and it's reasonable value for money. At least that's what I've found. Now in terms of why I'm selling it, well, I like to experience various different watches, and hence why I'm moving on from the one that I have, just to get different variety within my repertoire of watches. But of course, different people will hold things for different lengths of time, and that's really up to them. But overall, those are my thoughts about the Breitling SuperOcean Heritage. Like I indicated, this particular watch is for sale, both on my website, luxuryprofessor.com, and also on Value Your Watch. And I'll include links to that in the description below, so do check that out if you're interested in the watch. Like I said, I quite like it, but again, a lot of it is subjective. And hopefully you'll find this video somewhat informative to you. If you have any thoughts about this watch, let me know that in the comments below. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I see you for future videos as well.